I want to call this business meeting to order. Thank you all for joining us. Today we're going to be voting on three important pieces of legislation: the Brownfields Reauthorization Act of 2023, the Strengthening Coastal Communities Act of 2023, and the Delaware River Basin Conservation Act of 2023. Before we do that, though, I want to take a moment to briefly discuss each of these bills and to recognize Senator Capito for any comments she'd like to make. The first bill we're going to consider today is a very successful Brownfield program under the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, affectionately known as Superfund. And since it began in 1995, the EPA Brownfield program has helped communities across our nation clean up contaminated lands. This program has been a remarkable success, breathing new life into distressed areas. In fact, just yesterday, EPA made $235 million in grants available to assess and clean up polluted brownfield sites across our country, thanks to funding from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. The Brownfield Reauthorization Act, which Senator Capito and I, along with our staff, have authored together, would reauthorize the program through 2029 and increase the funding for formula grants to states, to territories, and to tribes. In addition, we made several additional changes to make the program more accessible to small, disadvantaged, and underserved communities. Next, we're going to consider the Strengthening Coastal Communities Act of 2023, which would codify new and updated maps under the Coastal Barrier Resources Act. This legislation will also help the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service modernize its implementation of the Coastal Barrier Resources Act. Since its enactment in 1982, spearheaded by my friend and predecessor in the U.S. House of Representatives, Congressman Tom Evans, the Coastal Barrier Resources Act has saved billions, that's billions with a B, billions of taxpayer dollars and conserves sensitive habitat for humanity. It's a true win-win situation. I want to salute former Congressman Evans for his leadership all those years ago and thank Senator Graham for partnering with me on this important legislation. Finally, we're going to vote on the Delaware River Basin Conservation Reauthorization Act of 2023, which would reauthorize a successful non-regulatory grant program that supports restoration activities in the Delaware River watershed. In addition to providing habitat for countless wildlife species, the Delaware River Basin supplies water to more than 14 million people, including in major cities like Philadelphia, New York City, and Wilmington, Delaware. I want to thank Senator Capito, our staffs, for her support in advancing this legislation. And with that, let me recognize our ranking member, Senator Capito, for any comments she'd like to make. Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think we're awaiting the arrival of two more of our members before our votes. That's correct?
How many do we have?
Two more.
Two more.
Two more. So
we need 10 to start. Yeah.
I will cease talking when the two more walk into the room.
Fair enough.
Anyway, thank you for calling this business meeting today. I'm pleased to have the reauthorization of the brownfields. It's important for my area, and I know for yours as well.
Down to one.
We're down to one. Okay. If I keep talking, it'll come right in.
Yeah.
Thank you for being a great partner again, and this time on bipartisan legislation to reauthorize Brownfield. You've described it. It's a valuable financing tool for local communities and private investors, facilitating economic development. It's been used very well in West Virginia. We have some new projects coming in on our old Brownfield projects. Since being authorized in 2002, it's become a resounding success story. The program has been, as I mentioned, a big benefit to West Virginia, $41 million being awarded to our state since 2005. Those have leveraged $1.6 billion in public and private investment, creating 5,400 jobs. That's significant. This committee stakeholder testimony detailing the aspects of the program, including George Carrico, who's director of the West Virginia Regional Brownfields Assistance Center at Marshall University, highlighted rigorous and complex application procedures that were sowing confusion. I think we heard that consistently. Rural communities often cannot afford grant writers and are unable to compete with their large urban counterparts. And because this Brownfield bill is so great, and because Senator Cardin just came into the room, I want to take 1 second to thank my staff member, Jake Kennedy, and your staff member, Brian Eiler, for their hard work on Brownfields. The other two bills are just as great, and so let's get on with our business. Thank you.
All right. Senator Capito, thank you. Welcome, everybody. I see that we've got a Voting quorum present, so let's begin. First, I call up the Brownfields Reauthorization Act of 2023. Does any senator wish to offer an amendment to this legislation? Senator Sullivan has an amendment that he was going to, in fact, two that I think he was going to offer. We were going to vote on the first, not the second. In his absence, I'm going to call up the First Amendment nonetheless, and to say that I'm pleased to support Senator Sullivan's Amendment Number 1, which will ensure that Alaska Native tribes have access to the Brownfields program. Senator Caput, any comment?
I second that. I certainly, and I'm in agreement on that amendment for Senator Sullivan.
Yeah. I now move that the committee adopt Sullivan Amendment Number 1. Is there a second? We have a second?
Second.
Yes. And all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, say nay. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is adopted, and Senator Sullivan had another amendment that we're going to continue to work on before we take the bill to the floor. So we look forward to doing that with him and his staff. Does any other senator wish to offer another amendment to this legislation? Any others? Okay. As we have no further amendments, I move that the committee favorably report the Brownfield Reauthorization Act of 2023. Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say nay. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. We'll now consider strengthening Coastal Community Act of 2023. No senator filed amendments to this legislation, and we were reported by voice vote. I move that the committee favorably report the Strengthening Coastal Communities Act of 2023. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed say nay. The ayes have it. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The legislation is favorably reported. I note for the record that a quorum of the committee is present. Next, I call up S. 654, the Delaware River Basin Conservation Act of 2023. No senators have filed amendments to this legislation. We'll report it by voice vote. I move that the committee favorably report S. 654, the Delaware River Basin Conservation Act of 2023. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say nay. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. And I note for the record the quorum of the committee is present. That concludes the committee's votes as part of today's business meeting. I thank everyone for their participation, especially thank our ranking member, and I will recognize any member who would like to speak on any of the matters that are before us that we have voted on. Thank you. Senator Capito, thank you. Anything else you want to say? Anything else you'd like to add?
Oh, I'm ready to move to the hearing.
Okay. All right.
Did it. Did it. Yeah.
That was great.
You lost your amendment by one vote.
It was a hard-fought battle. We spilled a lot of blood. All right, folks.
Mr. Chairman, may I just say thank you to
Yeah,
my
no.
colleagues for
Sure.
moving forward.
Take
on
another minute. Take another minute.
those amendments. They're It's an issue that I've raised here many times, and you, actually, the chairman, has been a great supporter of some of the issues of contaminated Alaska Native lands that they received as part of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act from the federal government, and then ended up that the lands were contaminated. And we've been trying to deal with that in this committee in a bipartisan way for a number of years, and I appreciate my colleagues' bipartisan support on my amendment number 1 that just passed by more than one vote, I'm told. So I'm glad.
It was a landslide.
I'm glad that that happened. So we'll continue to work
I
together
think
with
your amendments do better when you're not in the room.
Yeah, maybe. I'm trying to dive into the implications of that statement from the ranking member, but I don't think they're good for me, but whatever.
We're going to move to reconsider. If you
No, I'm not. And I know a good lawyer would normally say, just shut up, you've won your amendments. But we did have the EPA administrator in Alaska in August, who we held a roundtable with a lot of our Native leaders on these topics. So this is important progress, and I know the EPA's been supportive, so we'll keep working on it. And to my colleagues here, but Mr. Chairman, in particular, you and I have worked together on these issues a lot for my constituents, so I appreciate it, and thank you very much. I'm glad it passed.
Yeah, our pleasure. And you had a second amendment that we're going to continue to work on, and I think we'll be successful on that.
Yes, sir, and I know you know the EPA has come out in favor of that one too, so I think we can get through it as well. Thanks.
Good, thank you. Okay, and with now we're going to call this hearing to order. We've disposed of our business. Did some good work on 3 bills. That's pretty good morning's work already, but I want to start by thanking both of our witnesses. One of them who looks very familiar, I think I spent some time with you and a bunch of other people out at St. Elizabeth's and yesterday and for a tour. It was very interesting. Thanks for spending that time with us. But Commissioner Nina Albert and David Maroney for agreeing to testify before our committee this morning. We're here today to examine the current use of federal office space, affectionately known as the federal real estate footprint, and to identify opportunities for improving how to manage these assets on behalf of the American taxpayers. The General Services Administration, GSA, manages more than 363 million square feet of space across the country and 8,400 buildings. That's a lot. That's the equivalent of 240 U.S. Capitol buildings. Think about that. It's the equivalent of 240 U.S. Capitol buildings. Unfortunately, a recent GAO report found an alarming amount of this space is currently underutilized. According to this report from GAO, federal headquarters buildings on average have an occupancy rate of only 25%. Low occupancy is not a new challenge, as some of you know. In fact, the management of federal real property has been a challenge for decades. In 2023, the GAO placed the management of federal buildings on their high-risk list, due in large part to underutilized space. This to-do list, as I like to call it, Tom Coburn and I were partners together on the Homeland Security Committee, and we worked a lot with the GAO on their high-risk list year after year. But this to-do list, as I like to call it, calls attention to federal agencies and programs, areas that are high risk due to their vulnerabilities to fraud, to waste, to abuse, to mismanagement, and are most in need of transformation. Our late colleague, Senator Tom Coburn for Oklahoma, was a great partner, as I said, in our bipartisan efforts on the Homeland Security Committee to improve federal property management practices. Every 2 years, at the beginning of a new Congress, the GAO puts out their high-risk list. I always think of Tom Coburn and sort of renew my energy and my interest in making sure that we get him as much of that off that list undertaken and completed. Well, until now it's 2023. And the management of federal buildings remains on the high-risk list more than 20 years later. And to make matters more complicated, the GAO is considering adding the maintenance backlog for federal buildings to that list in 2025. It's clear that underutilization remains a problem, especially as many federal employees continue working remotely following the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, as President Biden calls on more federal employees to return to the office, GSA must work with agencies to identify ways to consolidate, co-locate, and dispose of space to meet current and future needs. After all, an average federal building capacity of 25% is to be blunt about it, I think it's a waste of resources. It's not sustainable or fiscally responsible way to manage our federal real estates. So we know that GSA faces significant challenges when it comes to modernizing and right-sizing our federal buildings. But as I often say, in adversity lies opportunity. I'll say it again this morning. In adversity lies opportunity. More than half of GSA managed leases are set to expire by 2027. This is an opportunity for the agency to truly right-size our federal office space after years of just talking about it. We also know that it's possible to save the federal government and our taxpayers money, a lot of money, while tackling climate change at the same time. Last Congress, we provided the GSA with robust funding through bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act to modernize and right-size buildings in their portfolio. This includes making buildings more energy efficient and resilient to climate change, as well as promoting the use of low-carbon construction materials. We look forward to hearing more on the implementation of these investments from our witnesses today. And with that in mind, yesterday I was able to join some of the folks in this room, some people sitting behind me, to again visit the Department of Homeland Security's St. Elizabeth campus. This is a project I've been focused on since my time as chairman of the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. The Department of Homeland Security began efforts to consolidate its headquarters in 2005. It's been a long, complicated process. Thanks to a $288 million investment from the Inflation Reduction Act, GSA has been able to finally relocate the headquarters of the U.S. Cyber Security and Infrastructure Security Agency, known as CISA, as well as the Immigration and Customs Enforcement to the St. Elizabeth's campus, and that's no small feat. According to GSA, these consolidation efforts are going to reduce the department's real estate footprint by over 1.2 million square feet in the capital budget region, the equivalent of 21 football fields. I did 21 football fields. And what's more, it's expected to save taxpayers some $1.3 billion with a B, over the next 30 years. As I said earlier today, today's hearing is an opportunity to think strategically about how we move forward together to support and encourage GSA's efforts to right-size and modernize the federal workforce. It's going to take a collaborative effort on the part of the GSA and each federal agency to determine the amount of office space that the government needs now and into the future as workforce policies continue to evolve. And with that, we look forward to hearing the testimony of what efforts GSA is already taking to address the challenges of managing the federal real estate portfolio, as well as what we can do and be doing to be better stewards of the federal taxpayers' money. As I often say, everything that I do, I know I can do better. The same can be said here. We can do better. We need to do better. And before we hear from our witnesses, I'm happy to turn to our ranking member, Senator Capito, for her opening remarks. Senator Capito, thanks for your strong interest in this, ongoing interest in this topic, and for your encouragement for us to hold today's hearing. You are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks, welcome to our witnesses. And I want to thank you for calling this hearing. It's something I am very interested in. Even before the increased telework policies that followed COVID-19, there was a need to reduce the federal real estate portfolio. This expansion of remote work has led to a renewed focus on modernizing that portfolio as communities across the country watch our federal buildings continue to sit empty. This summer, Mr. Maroney, who's one of our witnesses, shared preliminary results from GOE's work on the space utilization of federal buildings before a House committee. As we will discuss today, GAO found that, these numbers are stunning in my opinion, that 17 of the 24 federal agency headquarters that they reviewed, this is in the Washington, D.C. area, used an estimated average of 25% or less on their respective buildings' capacity. GAO found that GSA was only utilizing an estimated 11% of the space in their headquarters building. I know that GSA has taken actions to improve their space utilization, but clearly more work needs to be done. GAO also found that a particular federal agency if all assigned staff entered the building on the same day, would then still only be using 67% of the building's capacity based on usable square feet. Each year, it costs billions of taxpayer dollars to operate and maintain these federal buildings, regardless of their utilization. Well, this is simply unacceptable. I was encouraged to see the Biden administration call on federal agencies to increase the amount of in-person work following the release of this result. Although, anecdotally, however, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is being jammed by its employees' labor union into consideration of policies that would actually further reduce time spent in the office. Literally 2 days every 2 weeks, a day constitutes 4 hours. Crazy. My concerns with the federal real estate portfolio remain and grow as more time passes and resources continue to be wasted to heat, cool, and maintain underutilized buildings. The committee's done a lot of legislative work to support policies that will reduce emissions. I would be interested to know the emissions associated with heating and cooling these buildings that are unoccupied. It is clear that federal agencies have too much space, and significant changes need to be made to our federal real estate portfolio to prevent unnecessary costs. Approximately half of all active leases in the public buildings services leased inventory are expiring in the next 5 years. This provides us a unique opportunity to course correct and right-size the portfolio. GSA will play a very important role in this modernization effort, and other agencies will play an equally important role. In order for GSA to make appropriate investments in existing buildings and evaluate lease options, federal agencies must identify their current and future space needs. Providing these agencies with better benchmarks regarding space and an understanding of what full utilization is would help with these efforts. The process for disposing and consolidating federal buildings can be lengthy. Congress passed legislation to try to address this issue. Unfortunately, this legislation has yet to produce the intended results. The committee is willing and really eager to work collaboratively with GSA and other federal agencies to ensure that they have modern workspaces they need to carry out their missions while generating significant savings for our taxpayers. However, this needs to be a partnership, and greater communication between all parties is critical to achieving success in this matter. I appreciate the monthly calls that are occurring now between GSA staff and staff on the committees of jurisdiction. I feel this is a step in the right direction. However, I do believe that GSA needs to be more forthright and responsive to this committee. I understand there have been, at times, a lack of transparency from GSA on routine oversight questions. Last Congress, then the chairman mentioned this, the Inflation Reduction Act, which I did not support, provided GSA but $3.4 billion. As GSA requests more funding, it is important to understand how the agency is using these existing resources. I was disappointed to hear that GSA did not provide my staff with an update on their efforts to develop low-embodied carbon material standards when it was requested. Despite the known interest from this committee, GSA released their interim requirements several weeks later with very little advance notice to my staff, even though we had expressed interest in this. GSA's lack of transparency and responsiveness underscores the ongoing need for improved communication. I understand that GSA has put forward legislative changes to the agency's authority that may help modernize the federal real estate portfolio as part of their fiscal year 2024 budget request. If GSA would like this committee to give full consideration to their legislative proposals, including one that provides them with more authority, they need to be more responsive to this committee. I look forward to a productive discussion on how we can work together to modernize the federal real estate portfolio, and thank you both for being here.
Senator Capito, thanks for your, not just for those words, but also thank you for your focus on these issues, trying to make sure we use some common sense and save some money. To our witnesses, you don't see a lot of members sitting out here. We're looking at the end of the fiscal year in just a couple of days, and there's a threat of government shutdown. A bunch of committees that are having hearings today. I'm praying that we don't have a shutdown, but also trying to make sure that whatever we can get done, and if that should actually happen, that we're ready for it. So I'm being called to come and vote in one of my other committees, Homeland Security Committee, that I used to chair. They need me there now to have a quorum, I think. And I will be back shortly. Senator Capito is going to preside in the meantime. But let me just say, today we're going to hear from the Honorable Nina Albert, Commissioner of Public Building Service at GSA. In her role as Commissioner, Ms. Albert oversees the management of more than 363 million square feet of space in 8,397 buildings, almost 8,400 buildings nationwide. Commissioner Albert, we thank you for joining us today. Thanks for your service. How long have you served the people of this country?
Well, I was in the military. And
yeah, what did you do in the military?
I was a Signal Corps officer.
And
in the 141 Signal Battalion in Germany.
Germany? Are you Army? Army?
I was Army, yeah.
Navy salutes Army.
Thank you.
That's
yeah. I've got to record that.
There you go. A different uniform, same team, I like to say.
Exactly.
But we thank you for joining us. Thank you for all your service. And you are recognized for 5 minutes, and then the baton will be passed to your sidekick there, okay? Thank you, Senator Capito. Thank you very much. I'll be back.
Thank you so much. Good morning, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, and distinguished members of the committee. My name is Nina Albert, and I'm the Commissioner of the Public Building Service at the General Services Administration. I appreciate the committee's invitation to discuss this opportunity on how to achieve long-term cost savings by optimizing the federal real estate footprint to best align building utilization with mission delivery. I'm glad to be here today and share how GSA is helping federal agencies address their space needs and how right-sizing the federal footprint can be accelerated if GSA gains full access to annual collections that are deposited into the Federal Buildings Fund. Many agencies realize that they can adapt their workplaces to more effectively and cost-efficiently carry out their missions. Post-pandemic, agencies are gaining additional insights about the needs of their workforce, different and better approaches to achieving their mission, as well as approaches to the workplace. GSA is leveraging its experience and expertise to help agencies deliver a better workplace experience for their employees, as well as right-size their space to best deliver agency missions. Congressional support for GSA's fiscal year 24 budget request, including legislative reforms and the agency's $2.3 billion request for capital program investments, is critical to help address these concerns. Since 2011, the practice of diverting roughly $1 billion annually from the Federal Buildings Fund to other agencies has increased costs to GSA and inhibited sound portfolio management practices. Delays in funding necessary repairs exacerbate the deterioration of building conditions. We have seen minor issues grow into more costly repairs and replacements. It's also delaying consolidation plans, forcing the government to carry space that is underutilized while we wait for funding to complete work allowing for tenant relocations. My written testimony goes into greater detail on this, but one example I want to share with you today is that since 2014, GSA estimates that as many as 120 consolidation opportunities representing hundreds of millions in annual savings have been missed due to lack of available funding. All of these things increase costs to the federal government, especially when we are forced to make emergency repairs or delay space consolidations. In the most extreme cases, these delays have led to costly temporary relocations until the repairs were able to be completed. In addition to our funding request for projects in FY24, this year's budget request also includes a number of legislative proposals. The first is a proposal to facilitate GSA's full access to the annual revenues and collections that are deposited into the Federal Buildings Fund, while preserving Congress's role in choosing which projects to authorize and fund. GSA is also proposing an increase to its prospectus threshold from the current $3.4 million to $10 million, which we conservatively estimate will yield more than $50 million in annual cost avoidance. Finally, our budget request includes a third legislative proposal to facilitate our ability to assist other agencies in identifying and preparing real property for disposition. This will allow GSA to help agencies right-size their portfolios by providing the resources necessary to assess prepare, and accelerate the disposition of underutilized properties. These three proposals work to reduce timelines for project delivery, invest in federally owned properties, to improve building utilization and performance, and reduce timelines for disposition. The results will be a reduction on the reliance on privately owned or leased space, ultimately helping GSA to deliver the best value in real estate to our partners across government and to taxpayers. The opportunity before us is to transform the federal real estate portfolio into a high-performing and more efficient portfolio than today's inventory. I like to say that we want better buildings, but fewer buildings. With approximately half of our value in the lease portfolio expiring over the next 5 years, it is now the opportunity to have these conversations and provide solutions. But we can only maximize those opportunities if we're able to make the necessary investments in our own portfolio. I would like to thank this committee again for its willingness to address these issues and for being a critical partner as we work to modernize and right-size federal facilities. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today, and I look forward to answering any questions the committee may have.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. Next, we will hear from David Maroney, the Acting Director for Physical Infrastructure Team at the Government Accountability Office, we refer to as the GAO. Mr. Maroney has spent nearly 20 years at the GAO, providing oversight on many issues, including federal real property. Ms. Maroney, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, and members of the committee. I'm pleased to be here today to discuss the preliminary results of GAO's work on the utilization of federal buildings and its implications for optimizing the federal real property footprint. In the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, the federal government has a unique opportunity to reconsider how much office space it really needs to best achieve agency missions while saving taxpayer dollars. To get a sense of the magnitude of that opportunity, we assessed the extent to which 24 agencies utilized their headquarters buildings in January, February, and March of this year. What we found was that all 24 of those agencies had extra space, and that most agencies were using less than 25% of their headquarters capacity. While these figures are estimates, they point to a potentially large amount of unneeded office space. We identified 3 main reasons for this low utilization. First, many agencies had more space than they needed even before the pandemic. One of the reasons federal real property management has remained on GAO's high-risk list now for 20 years. Second, many headquarters buildings aren't configured in the best way. For example, some include storage areas and administrative spaces that simply aren't needed in the modern workplace. Third, agencies have embraced hybrid work. Telework and remote work certainly existed before the pandemic, but those workplace flexibilities are used much more frequently now. As a result, there are simply fewer people coming into headquarters buildings than there were before the pandemic. So why does this matter? Because low building utilization has significant costs, both to the government and to the taxpayer. For one thing, there are the financial costs. It costs billions of dollars each year to operate, maintain, and lease these buildings. In addition, holding on to unneeded office space has environmental costs. Office buildings take a significant amount of energy to run, whether people are at their desks or not. Finally, holding on to unneeded space has opportunity costs. Every dollar an agency spends on extra space is a dollar they don't have to spend on other priorities, and for local economies, unneeded federal space could potentially be put to more productive uses. To be clear, figuring out how much office space agencies really need and shedding any they don't won't be easy, quick, or cost-free. There are many challenges to doing so, including having the budget resources necessary to reconfigure space, lingering uncertainty about agency and office policies, and a lack of good benchmarks for measuring building utilization in a high telework environment. More generally, while there has been progress in better managing federal real property over time, significant issues remain, both in the process for disposing of unneeded space and with the data available to inform real property decisions. That being said, it is important not to lose sight of the unique opportunity agencies now have to creatively and fundamentally reconsider their office space needs. Agencies need to ask themselves, are there ways to reduce our footprint and save money while still ending up with more modern space that helps us better accomplish our mission? As the federal government's property manager, GSA plays a key role in supporting agencies as they plan and implement space solutions to best meet their needs. However, GSA cannot right-size federal road property on its own. Individual agencies are ultimately responsible for determining their own space needs and for moving forward with those decisions. OMB, too, plays a critical role in setting policies to help guide and influence agency real property decision-making. Taking full advantage of the current moment will require partnership and collaboration between these agencies. In conclusion, underused federal buildings have been and continue to be a costly challenge, and hybrid work has made that challenge even greater. As agencies implement their in-office policies, they need to take a fundamental look at their office space needs and move forward to modernize their real estate portfolios accordingly. If they do so, the federal government will be well-positioned to take advantage of the unique opportunity before it, optimize the federal real property footprint, and save taxpayer money. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my opening statement. I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Thank you both. And I am going to yield to my good friend, Senator Ricketts, to be the first one to question.
Great. Thank you very much for your leadership on this issue, Ranking Member Capito. And I also appreciate Chairman Carper bringing this up as well. It is far past time that we reevaluate the federal government's workforce and infrastructure needs here. And certainly the testimony we've heard here today says that it's long overdue. This has been around for a while. But before we get into that, I actually want to talk about another issue. It's great importance to my home state, which deals with the Inspector General releasing a report last week, or a memo, alerting the GSA Public Building Service of the contamination of Legionella bacteria in 6 GSA-controlled buildings across the country. Low occupancy levels in these buildings and subsequent water stagnation led to the growth of bacteria, the primary cause of Legionnaire's disease. One of these buildings is located in North Platte, Nebraska. It's a building that houses essential services, including the Social Security Administration, North Platte VA Clinic, the FBI, ICE, and several others. Commissioner Albert, OIG notified your office of the need to test the water contamination before reopening the buildings that experienced lower occupancy during the pandemic in the September of 2022. GSA's Public Building Service currently has no requirement for testing potable water systems in their owned or leased buildings, even after they sat vacant and the water stood stagnant through the pandemic. In the week since this alert memo has been made, what has the GSA done to protect human health in the affected buildings?
Well, thank you for this question. This is as soon as we learned about Legionella bacteria in certain buildings, we immediately notified tenants. That's first and foremost, just because human health is at risk. But we also contacted and are working very closely with the CDC and also ASHRAE, which assists with technical support, trying to identify what the appropriate response is and what we as building managers should be doing. The two things that are most critical for managing and moving water through and making sure that water quality is good is one, flushing of the water systems. And so we are now systematically doing that throughout all of our buildings. In the past, when buildings were occupied more readily, that water flushing activity would occur just more frequently. And it's frankly as a result of the pandemic that stagnation has occurred. So now we are flushing throughout our systems to make sure that that water is moving. The other thing is we're testing in all of our buildings, which is the primary way of identifying if there's any bacteria that's forming. And when there is, making sure that the chlorine levels and other types of corrective chemical treatment to water to move those, to eliminate that bacteria is dealt with. This is something that we are dealing with across our entire portfolio. We've also issued a notice and an alert to landlords of private leases where we lease space to make sure that they are also aware of what protocols we're putting into place. These protocols that we are moving forward with are among the first in the nation. These are things that everybody is learning about for the first time. And so I think communication testing, and then corrective action is what we've been able to achieve in a very short period of time in response.
And so have you had any reports of any of the employees or visitors becoming sick in any of these facilities?
We're aware of one individual who was confirmed with Legionella's infection and is being treated.
Was that in Nebraska or was that someplace else?
It's not in Nebraska, it's elsewhere.
Okay, thanks. And you talked about flushing the buildings. Is that the only corrective action you're going to need to do, or is there going to be other things that you need to do with regard to the bacteria?
Testing and flushing. Both of those things are what help us identify. Well, the flushing is actually just moving things along.
Right.
And that we can do just as part of common practice. But the testing is really the new element that we've introduced into this.
But you don't think you're going to have to do anything else as far as remediation other than just get the water moving through?
When it's identified, when the tests reveal that there might be a presence of Legionellas, we're closing down. Legionella is a bacteria that forms around a fixture or around a particular element. It doesn't necessarily spread to the whole building if you can isolate that fixture. And so where we identify, and many of our buildings are quite large, that there's a presence, we'll try and control it by managing in those particular areas where the bacteria is forming.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Obviously, this is something that we're going to follow up with you with regard to the North Platte office, and just making sure we keep in touch with regard to what the cleanup's going to be and making sure we're looking out for the health and safety of the folks that work there as well as the visitors coming there. And Ranking Member Capito, or Chairman Carper's back. Okay, very good. Are we going to do a second round of questions? Okay, great.
I believe so, yes.
Great.
Senator Capito, thank you very much for presiding. Happy to be back. We did our work in the Homeland Security Governmental Affairs Committee. Now we'll conclude our work here today. I have a couple of questions, and my first question would be, I think for both of you, I'd like for both of you to take a shot at this if you would. But I'm concerned with July's GIO report on space utilization of federal agency headquarters buildings. And it's troubling to me that, as I said earlier, GAO found on average federal headquarters buildings had an occupancy rate of about 25%. 25%. Ms. Maroney, Commissioner Albert, I often like to quote Albert Einstein, who once said that in adversity lies opportunity. In adversity lies opportunity. As I mentioned in my statement, more than 50% of GSA's managed leases are set to expire by 2027. About 50% of GSA's managed leases are set to expire by 2027. So how should GSA capitalize on these expiring leases to address the low occupancy rates in federal buildings, please?
Okay, I'll take the first shot at that, and then I'll turn it to my colleague here. So I believe that these expiring leases are a great opportunity. What we're learning already is that as an expiring lease is coming due, we start working with agencies very closely about 2 years in advance of a lease expiration, identifying what their future space needs are, where they could consolidate to save money, and start planning those moves in advance. So the conversations are happening right now. We are finding that, first of all, we're relying on a practice that we've put into place for the past 5 years in terms of having that early conversation with tenants, that we have been, in the past, been able to save significant amount of lease cost as a result of proper planning. So in the last 5 years, we've saved over $6 billion in lease cost avoidance. That is a tremendous track record that we absolutely will build on going forward. You mentioned the underutilization of buildings in the Washington region, for example. What we are finding now is that agencies are looking at their building capacity and identifying lease expirations in this region, and when appropriate, trying to pull those leases into federally owned properties, again, when their building is in good enough condition to be able to accept it, or as Mr. Maroney mentioned earlier, if the configuration of the building is appropriate for whatever that use is. So I think that the lease expirations are absolutely the right trigger. We're seeing agencies make good decisions. They are reducing the ones that have occurred in the last 3 years. We're seeing reductions in lease requests by anywhere between 25 to 40%. So the good work is being done, but it is a process, particularly when we are looking to backfill federally owned property because of the challenges that Mr. Maroney highlighted.
Okay, thank you, thank you. Commissioner, not Commissioner, but Mr. Maroney. Same question, please.
Very good. So it certainly is an opportunity with that number of leases expiring and with the underutilization of properties that we've highlighted today. I concur agencies are making decisions on both their in-office attendance policies, which drives some of this, as well as what their space needs are. They need to act promptly, given the timeframes we're talking about here, and figure out how much space they really need in owned buildings and in leased facilities. And to the extent it makes sense to move from leased facilities into owned space, that's a good path forward. Again, given that time frame, it's an opportunity. It's a short-term opportunity, so it's important to be taking the actions that Ms. Albert described.
Okay. Are there any other additional ways to address space utilization within GSA's existing authorities?
Well, right now, our authorities allow us to evaluate, work with agencies, and try and drive utilization through the authorities that we have. The challenges that we really have are access to the Federal Buildings Fund. And I just want to spend 1 minute on why this is so important.
I'm not surprised.
Okay.
This is a pitch well telegraphed. Go ahead.
Well, so for example, the Federal Buildings Fund is the fund into which it was designed to be a quasi-revolving fund. We collect revenue from agencies for rent. That money gets reinvested in buildings to maintain them. The fund is also where all of the sales proceeds from dispositions are deposited and any other collections we have. That money, if it could be designed or maintained as a quasi-revolving fund, gets put back into supporting agency moves, consolidations, capital improvements so that folks can fully occupy buildings. We have had, as I mentioned in my oral testimony, every year about $1 billion shortfall in getting access to the Federal Buildings Fund. We have seen that in the last 12 years since that has been the case, our liabilities within our own portfolio growing significantly to currently being more than $11 billion. What does that practically mean for an agency that's in a leased space that wants to move into a federal building? Well, now the federal building condition is not as good as what they could buy on the lease market. And it's because we haven't been able to maintain our buildings the way that we should. So there's an inherent inefficiency in not getting full access to the revenues that we collect that are designed to be put back into buildings. That's one of the authorities that we're seeking. The other thing is, during this time and opportunity—
Just hold it right there, if you would. Are there other examples in federal government with, like, harbor maintenance fund that could be something, maybe it might serve as an example? Just take a minute on that.
Sure. The Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund is something that was designed almost very similarly and comparably to how the Federal Buildings Fund is. Those were funds that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was collecting from the private sector, putting it into a fund, and it was designed to repair, maintain ports or other waterways. And again, they hadn't had full access to that, so they're collecting the fees, it's going into a pot, but it's not being used for its designed purpose. As a result, I know that that Congress has and the Army Corps of Engineers worked together for almost 2 decades to get the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund authorities and access restored.
Only 2 decades.
I am hoping that now that Congress has understood the value of the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, you will understand the value of getting full access to the Federal Buildings Fund.
Yeah. Well, my colleagues also hear me say, in addition to quoting Einstein, they also hear me say, find out what works and do more of that. So this is maybe one that we can take a close look at. Go ahead.
There's one other thing that we've requested, and I think it's a really important point. It's not sexy, but it's important for efficiency. So we have requested increase to our prospectus threshold. Right now, GSA's prospectus threshold is $3.6 million. That means that any investment in a building that exceeds $3.6 million, whether it's an elevator repair, a roof repair, a boiler replacement, a chiller replacement, which, by the way, on a building of this scale and size tends to be over $3.6 million, has to come to Congress. That internally, from GSA's perspective, as well as through the congressional process, takes up to 2 years to get approval. That means that that repair that was identified more than 2 years ago has escalated in cost and has contributed to greater deteriorating conditions. We are requesting that our prospectus threshold get increased to $10 million. We think that that's appropriate when we look at other agencies that have similar authorities. For example, the VA, their prospectus threshold is $20 million. The DOD doesn't have a prospectus threshold and are permitted to invest in like-kind replacement, so a boiler for a boiler, without any prospectus threshold. So those are the two pieces of legislation that I think have immediate impact on ability to consolidate. And then in terms of ability to dispose more quickly.
I'm going to ask you to hold it right there. I'm way over my time. And we'll come back and always pick up on this when it's my turn again. Senator Capito, thanks for your patience.
Thank you. Commissioner Albert, in June, the GSA announced its plan to spend $1 billion, that's from the IRA, to make more than 100 buildings cleaner and more energy efficient. Did the GSA look at the space utilization rates for each of those buildings to determine whether this is the best use of our dollars?
Absolutely. So for the past year, what we have been doing is looking through our entire inventory, identifying what we call segmenting the inventory into core assets. These are assets that the federal government should reinvest in because it serves a special need for the federal government. We've also identified candidates for disposition. And then, there's kind of the bulk, if you will, of the assets that we are transitioning through. Those 100 buildings that were proposed and that we're moving forward with improving through Inflation Reduction Act funds are core assets. These are assets that the federal government should continue to own for over the long term, and that we would be best served by investing these funds in
So
it.
those are probably assets that I would say probably don't need the Federal Building Trust Fund money because they're probably in good shape anyway.
Well, I would not conclude that. The Inflation Reduction Act fund money is for very specific uses. The Federal Buildings Fund has much more flexibility in being able to pay for moves for agencies.
Right.
Being able to other improvements.
Just so I understand, so the 100 buildings will do the emissions and sustainable technologies, but the buildings may not be in good shape.
So the inflation.
Physically, for room and space utilization. That we
Correct.
talked.
It may not be proproperly configured.
So
Or
why,
you need
why are we doing that? Why wouldn't we pick another building that has the great configuration, and that you're matching up both missions, so that you then have you don't have to worry about whether you're going to maintain them or the bathrooms work or whatever.
Well,
You see what I'm saying?
Well, I think in terms of configuration, it's very common, even in the private sector, that you're constantly reconfiguring space inside a building. I don't consider that building condition. The building condition to me is the core and shell, is the plumbing working, is the heating working, is the roof in good shape. So for example, the IRA dollars, particularly the $1 billion for emerging and sustainable technologies, is not a replacement of a roof. That would be used for a replacement of the heating and cooling systems to make them all electric, for example. That's the purpose of the IRA dollars. In a federal building, we may need both of those things to be true, to replace the roof and make that building envelope sound, as well as modernizing the heating and cooling
Quick
equipment.
question on the federal buildings. You say $1 billion is being taken from it every year. How much is in that every year, yearly?
It varies between $10 to $11 billion a year.
So a 10% cut.
Correct.
Is taken
And,
away. So you got another $10 billion to make these buildings right.
And 5.6 of that is for payment of leases.
Okay. So you're saying that the standard utilization, that you're looking at standard utilization before you make these investments in these buildings. Mr. Maroney, without a standard utilization benchmark, do you have concerns that investment decisions are being made with incomplete information. I mean, what I'm understanding is these agencies don't have standardized utilization benchmarks. I mean, are they all over the place? Do some have them, some don't? What did you find?
So in terms of the utilization measures, there is a range of benchmarks right now that are used, 180 square feet to 210, 150. It varies by agency. There isn't a specific utilization benchmark, which is an important area of focus, I think, going forward, is to come up with not necessarily a one-size-fits-all benchmark for every type of space, but some more consistent benchmarks, more consistent targets for how we measure space and how we determine what is fully utilized.
Right, and then you have the situation where people are coming in 2 days every 2 weeks for 4 hours a day. Shouldn't they be shared space? And then that cuts the space utilization, right?
Correct. If you
Are
share
agencies doing that?
some are, some aren't. It depends
Well,
on the
how do we
agency.
get them all to do that?
That's individual agencies making the decision with their in-office attendance policies of how they're going to implement. So, and
Is
one
that done at each agency? I don't mean to interrupt you here, but I'm interested in this. Is that done at the agency, or does the GSA make that? Does GSA say you have to have a space utilization that looks at what your telecommuting policies, which I personally don't like what we're seeing here, but that doesn't matter what I like, I guess. Who makes that decision?
So the agencies are deciding on their in-office attendance.
Right, they decide the attendance, but, so everybody's got a different benchmark then. Wouldn't it be good to have sort of a uniform benchmark to be able to make better fiscal decisions?
It would be good to have more consistent benchmarks government-wide. Again, not necessarily one size fits all, not to be overly
Right, because you
prescriptive.
have some people that don't work in the office.
Right, and different types
foresters
of
or
buildings,
whatever.
but it would be good to have better benchmarks than we have that account for higher levels of telework.
Right, okay. Do you know approximately how many projects are currently unoccupied in the public building service? Do you, I guess this would be to you, Commissioner Albert. How many properties in the public building services inventory are currently unoccupied?
We hardly have any buildings unoccupied. We have buildings that are underutilized, but buildings that are unoccupied usually move to the disposition list or will eliminate.
But doesn't the GAO report say that you're really not moving quick enough? The consistent reports over the last 20 years is you're really not dispensing of this property as quickly, and the authorities that we were giving you here in Congress are not really working. I said that in my opening statement. Is that a true statement?
I think that well, first of all, the relationship and how all of this comes together is that the agency expresses what their demand or needs for space are, and we supply that space. We have expertise to inform them how to identify how much space they need, just to answer your earlier question. Okay. OMB in the past has issued freeze the footprint and reduce the footprint. That has driven over the past 10 years 45 million square feet of space reduction. So there has been space reductions as a result of policy guidance. Now is a good time for continued policy guidance. And at this moment, what is occurring is utilization in the GAO report has highlighted and indicated that there is underutilized space, particularly in the headquarters buildings. That is different out in the regions or field offices. You see different activity in buildings. Where you see the greatest opportunity to contract is in general office space. For example, the VA and community-based outpatient centers, that we're expanding that program. So operational facilities may be expanding, but it's in general office space where telework is most frequently adopted, where you're seeing the greatest opportunity to consolidate. In order to be able to consolidate and drive the cost savings that we ultimately want to get to, it takes money to facilitate those moves.
Right, you have $10 billion a year.
$10 billion a year, all of which is obligated. $5.6 billion goes to paying rent contracts. Another about $3 billion goes to operating and maintenance. And where we're seeing the greatest cuts in our budget is in repair and alteration. About 50% of our repair and alteration request every year is cut in half.
Mr. Maroney, did your report get into any of this in terms of the operation or the building trust fund, and that's the reason we can't sell buildings and can't consolidate?
We didn't get into the building trust fund. We do identify, agency officials identified one challenge is having the funding needed to reconfigure space. It does take money to reconfigure, to consolidate. Sometimes you have to invest money to save money. But we didn't get into detail about the federal building fund itself. I think that's a balance between funding, Congress's funding decisions and agency needs.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Cardin, that's okay.
Let me thank both of you for your service. I'm going to follow up on Senator Capito's point, maybe from a little bit different angle. So let me just refresh everyone's recollection that in the Inflation Reduction Act, Congress was very specific in providing resources, $2 billion for low-carbon materials, $250 million for building retrofits, and $975 million for emerging sustainable technologies. It was a focus on sustainability and our responsibilities as the owners and occupiers of the federal facilities to add to the sustainability efforts that we are made in as a nation and part of our international responsibilities. So I want to get a better understanding on how you are dealing with the question that Senator Capito asked. How are you dealing with sustainability versus our square footage needs? And so that we can have adequate space, but also comply with the clear direction by Congress.
Well, what's pretty elegant about this entire thing is that we can serve both needs. Investment in buildings and making them more usable makes them more attractive so that we can consolidate out of leases and into owned facilities. First of all, I just want to share a little bit of a status of where we are in terms of placing funds from the Inflation Reduction Act. $2 billion of it was for low embodied carbon materials. That's in flat glass, concrete, asphalt, and steel. We have launched a pilot for 11 buildings. The investment in those 11 buildings represents $1 billion out of those $2 billion. And that's really to socialize and get feedback from industry, the pilot is, to identify what specifications are acceptable and available for implementation. So that is ongoing and should be wrapping up here before the end of the calendar year. That will be setting the stage and the standard for the building industry, which is what GSA has done in the past when we adopted LEED 20 years ago. It has set the standard for what sustainable buildings can and should be. As to the emerging and sustainable technologies funding, we have identified, as Senator Carper had mentioned in his opening remarks, $288 million to go into the DHS headquarters at St. Elizabeth's. And that is to make DHS campus a model for sustainability. It also tells the consolidation story. That investment and ability to deliver on 3 more buildings at St. Elizabeth's will further consolidate multiple leases around the National Capital Region.
Let me interrupt you on that, because the largest single project is the replacement complex for the FBI. I'm not going to get into the battles on the specific locations. I'm not even going to ask you about that. But it does give us a chance to really make a statement in sustainability. Are we on track in the process to determine how we're moving forward and make a decision?
We are on track. We share your urgency, and we are aligned in making the decision as quickly as possible.
I've heard that for about a decade, so I hope that you will keep us engaged as to that process. There's a lot of competition, but there's no disagreement on the need to move forward, and in regards to making that a model in regards to sustainability with the tools that are available. So we look forward to that. So let me talk about one existing structure that you should knock down and rebuild for many different reasons. That's the courthouse in Baltimore. It has the honor of being, I'm going to get my numbers back, built in 1970s. It was noted as the least expensive courthouse per square foot. And we got what we paid for. It's not only inadequate as far as they keep on pouring millions and millions of dollars into it for repairs and patchwork, but it is an example of a building that gives us the opportunity to meet the needs of the federal bench a federal courthouse in Baltimore, but at the same time balance that with sustainability. Are you trying to identify projects like that are win-win projects to get the needs met, but also give us a chance to replace a carbon terrible building with one that would be best for sustainability?
Absolutely. So I had mentioned that we've identified and segmented our portfolio into core assets, transitioning assets, and disposal candidates. Those core assets are those ones that we are seeking to make at the highest level of sustainability, as well as other types of performance, including utilization. So that is why the IRA dollars that we've been using, as well as directing most of our federal buildings fund requests, capital improvements, to be in those core assets, which will, again, not only drive the highest level of sustainability in those buildings, lead the market by doing so, demonstrating that it can be done, as well as maximizing utilization of that building.
Well, thank you. I just really point out, this is, as we've said many times, once in a generation opportunity to make significant progress in our federal buildings to deal with our responsibilities for sustainability. And I just hope that you will be aggressive, keep us engaged, and look at these buildings that need to be replaced or the new ones coming along, and show the nation and show the world that we're taking the leadership on this issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Carter, thank you for your long-time interest in these issues. And as we go forward from here and to the floor and take some action, we hope and expect you to be fully engaged. We welcome that. Okay, we've been joined by Senator Markey and Senator Merkley. Senator Markey, I think you're first, and then Senator Merkley, you're right behind him.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. The Massachusetts emergency shelter system has 6,500 families right now and 22,000 individuals in a shelter system that is at capacity. And the need for shelter will only increase during the winter. The federal government is the single largest owner of real estate in the nation, but much of the capacity goes unused. So it's a no-brainer that we ought to be converting surplus federal assets into properties that may be used to provide emergency shelters, permanent housing, and services to the homeless. Through partnership with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, GSA has already made thousands of properties available for housing, but more could be done. Commissioner Albert, are you working to increase the number of suitable properties transferred from GSA to nonprofits and local governments experiencing severe shortages in housing and shelter space?
Well, thank you for that question, and we absolutely are. The circumstances in most of our buildings that are underutilized that could be made available for disposal or disposition for others to use is that they are not fully empty. So that is why we've requested full access to the Federal Buildings Fund. It's why we're asking for expanded authority for use of our disposal fund, so that that last remaining agency that might have a foothold in an underutilized building can confidently say, I'm moving out because I know where I'm going, and has the funds to do that. We've had great track record of success in putting property on the market, either doing a government-to-government transfer, offering property for redevelopment with not-for-profits. And I specifically want to point to a recent success story in that, which is in Alameda in California, where we disposed of a piece of property and it was converted to 400 units of homeless supported housing. So there are many examples of that, but the key to moving forward on any of that is being able to take that last small footprint of federal use that's in a building and incentivize it or provide it with the resources to move out so that we can recycle those buildings for better use.
So the GSA is willing then to transfer GSA leased buildings in whole or in part to nonprofits and local governments to be used for affordable housing?
Did you say lease buildings, sir?
That's right.
Well, that will be more complicated because there's a landlord, a private landlord, that would need to agree to that. We don't control the building.
Would you be willing to participate in a pilot project to accomplish that goal in leased buildings for the transfer.
Certainly be happy to talk to you about how we could effectuate something like that.
Yeah, I would like to work with you on that,
Okay.
to have a pilot project so that we might be able to accomplish that goal. Thank you. And I'm deeply alarmed that GSA is failing to address urgent safety issues and ongoing infrastructure deficiencies at the John F. Kennedy Federal Building in Boston. Senator Warren and I both have staff who work out of that building every day, 24 stories high. It's a complete federal building. More than 2,000 people work in the JFK building, including GSA staff. Thousands of others come to the building for necessary appointments, for citizenship appointments, taxpayer assistance, veterans benefits. All those agencies are in the building. There are several people who have already had issues, just difficulty in ensuring that their voices can be heard because the elevators routinely malfunction. They're dropping, they're trapping people for hours, delivering occupants to the wrong floor, idling useless after a floor button is pressed. In one recent instance, it required hours-long intervention of the Boston Fire Department to extricate trapped individuals in a malfunctioning elevator, with the incident appearing on Boston local television stations because of the seriousness of the issue. Conditions are unacceptably dangerous and inaccessible, elevators, asbestos, and at 5:55 every day, all the lights go off, and the air conditioning, and the heating for the entire building. And individual offices cannot continue to work. Everyone has to get out. So it doesn't seem like the elevators are going to be fully fixed until 2025. That can't be the speed at which our government works. So, Commissioner Albert, do you think it's acceptable for your GSA colleagues, my staff, and thousands of other staff and visitors to be subjected to such ongoing building safety issues, not just for months, but now for multiple years?
I absolutely do not think it's acceptable. Life safety investments are our top priority and largest concern now. The reasons that buildings like the JFK building in Boston are in the condition that they are in is specifically tied to the limitations in access to the Federal Buildings Fund. I don't want to exaggerate that. That is an actual example of how our lack of access to the Federal Buildings Fund to maintain life safety equipment and concern and systems have not been able to be met. The need at JFK in particular, we requested in FY22 $150 million to make improvements to all of JFK because of, so we identified more than 4 years ago the needs to reinvest and improve JFK. We unfortunately didn't get the money in FY22, and now we have been able to invest one by one. We've spent $9 million on those elevator systems, but because of the prospectus threshold, we're having to invest in each elevator system one by one because it would take 2 years if we were to make an investment that exceeds the prospectus threshold. So in order to address the elevator concerns, we've been moving forward as quickly as we can, but we're having to go one by one rather than address the total needs of the building.
Okay, well, clearly this isn't working. So we have to figure this out. We shouldn't have empty building stock and crumbling buildings that people go to work in every single day. If this is a matter of figuring out our funding priorities or raising money by leasing government buildings, let's figure this out. But just like the JFK elevators, the status quo isn't working
Yes.
At GSA. Just isn't. The elevators are this system. So we have to be fair to these people who work, these 2,000 people who are in there every single day, in order to get a solution. And I really would request a focus on this issue at GSA to resolve these issues for that building.
If I just may say, I will absolutely follow up with you on this. What I seek is a partnership because it is a combination of actions between GSA as well as Congress in order to be able to correct this longstanding issue.
So let's create the partnership. Let's get it done.
Thank you.
But it's years now, and it's getting oppressive for people who work there. And many people now walk down 9, 12, 15 stories every single day because they don't want to get on the elevators. And that's just unfair to people And some people just ultimately wind up saying, I'm not going to work. Well, not because they don't want to go to work, they just don't want the 15, 18, 20 story walk, every single day, and it's just unfair to them. So thank you.
Well, I'd say to our witnesses that this committee has a pretty good reputation for partnerships, and then maybe this is another way we can demonstrate that. Senator Merkley, thanks for your patience. You're recognized. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Commissioner. And Commissioner, since 2015, mass timber has seen unprecedented growth in the United States, from just a handful of buildings 8 years ago to almost 2,000 today. American-made mass timber offers a way to dramatically lower carbon emissions associated with concrete and steel buildings, and it does so while enjoying some other significant benefits: seismic benefits, structural durability, increased resilience to fire, decreased construction time. The fiscal year 23 appropriations bill included directions for GSA to work with partners to expand the utilization of mass timber and innovative wood products in federal buildings. How are you implementing that?
So our team of engineers, particularly those that are experts in this, have been working with industry and researching what the opportunities for mass timber are for integration into federal buildings. I would love to follow up with you to provide more current and detailed status. But I will say that in general, where we are right now in terms of managing the portfolio and the opportunities before us are really around retrofitting and improving existing owned buildings as opposed to new construction, which is where we could integrate mass timber more readily. But we will get back to you in the committee on more details on what we found and the opportunities that we have for integrating mass timber.
Do you have a single mass timber building at this point?
I'm not aware of one, but we also haven't undertaken too many new construction projects.
No. Are you familiar with what mass timber is?
I am, yes.
Great. Well, just for others, it is the compilation of products that include mass plywood, where the plywood can become not an inch thick, but very, very thick, creating key structural elements, or other key laminated products, including massive floors. It sequesters a massive amount of carbon. You can assemble these as like an erector set very, very quickly, which saves a massive amount on construction loans. And unlike concrete and steel that take a tremendous amount of energy to create, these don't take a lot of energy to create. So huge advantages. I really encourage you to come back next year and saying, we do have some mass timber buildings that we've acquired for use or are building. So I'm just hoping for quicker, more significant action within the coming year. And Commissioner, plastic pollution is one of the greatest environmental threats of our time, driven largely by the use and disposal of single-use plastics. So GSA has the ability to make a difference by addressing single-use plastics across the federal government, purchasing contracts related to construction, to concessions, to facility maintenance contracts as well. As the GSA is modernizing its facilities in accordance with President Biden's executive orders on climate and clean energy, does the administration have explicit plans to minimize the procurement and use of plastic products, including the single-use and packaging plastics?
I'm not familiar off the top of my head of that, so I will absolutely look into that and follow up and provide you with an answer.
Great. Thank you. We are seeing that the plastic, which is made with fossil gas, is a huge contributor to climate chaos, which we're suffering everywhere. And also that the plastic on the other end ends up in our waterways, resulting in the pollution of our streams and our ocean. And we are now finding microplastics throughout human bodies, including the human heart, and the human breast milk, etc. And plastic contains endocrine disruptors, which affect reproductive health. So it is a factor in many, many ways, and the GSA could be a leader in taking this on. Can we count on you to thoroughly explore this question and pursue it, not just for our environment, but also for human health?
I'll absolutely follow up with you on this.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Ricketts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The federal property management has been on the high-risk list for GAO for 20 years. So this is an ongoing issue, not just an issue created by the pandemic. And certainly, remote work is one of the contributors to the lack of utilization of office space. And I agree with you, Ranking Member Capito. Remote work should be a tool, not an expectation of people. And it needs to be properly managed, just like everything else with regard to our space. When I was governor of Nebraska, we actually put together a strategy for our real estate. We worked with our state building division to come up with that. And what we focused on was consolidating our like-serviced agencies together to create a one-stop shop for people, but also to create synergies in their work output. So, for example, we put the Department of Economic Development, the Department of Agriculture, Department of Environment and Energy, other boards and commissions all together in one spot so that we could promote the interests of the state of Nebraska. We developed Fallbrook office space, and by doing that, we were able to consolidate, put those agencies over there and then consolidate our Department of Health and Human Services into one building in our downtown location to be able to provide better services there. Overall, that actually reduced our footprint by 60,000 square feet, saving Nebraska taxpayers $700,000 a year. And now we're hearing, of course, from your report that 75% of the office space in 17 agencies here in the Washington, D.C. are unused office space. Mr. Maroney, it sounds like your recommendations would be in line with what we did here at the state of Nebraska. Is that a fair statement to try and bring like-serviced agencies together?
I certainly think that would be one option for agencies to consider is consolidation, sharing space. Those should all be on the table.
Well, we talked about $7 billion. Is that roughly right, what we're spending every year on this office space?
On government-wide.
Yeah, government-wide. What do you think the cost savings would be if we could address the issues with regard to the unutilized office space and some of the other things we just talked about?
I don't have a specific number, but it certainly could be substantial. We spend a lot of money operating, maintaining, and leasing facilities in this country. You could save a lot if you get rid of extra space.
So when you say a lot, is that like 10%, or do you think 50%? What do you think?
It's hard to give an estimate, but substantial, depending on agency decisions.
Okay. And Commissioner, you talked a little bit about your role in this, but it sounds like, from what you said, it's really the agencies that have to drive these plans. Is that fair, that the agencies have to come up and say, hey, this is my utilization or the space I need, and the agencies have to drive this? You don't have the ability to tell agencies, hey, you got too much space, get out?
Well, we don't have the ability to tell them what to do, but it is a partnership, and it's often done in collaboration. Not all agencies are created equal. There's very large agencies that have big real estate staff within the agency, and they are creating their own plans. There's other agencies that rely on GSA's expertise, so it's a mix.
So, but you've helped facilitate it, but it really has to be the leadership of the agency to drive this. Is that what I'm understanding? Is that fair?
It is, but if I can just share a couple things that GSA has been doing, particularly since the pandemic, so that, kind of what the solutions are going forward are more on the forefront of people's minds, because there's been a lot of evolution about how people are using space. We created a workplace innovation lab. We've had more than 120 different tours by a variety of different agencies, even agencies that we don't manage space for example, the DoD, coming to see what the new workplace models are. We're launching federal co-working spaces in 6 locations across the country so that agencies can see what a more flexible workplace looks like, or that they can work out of our federal co-working spaces rather than relying on leases. So we're looking at new models and partnering with agencies so they can see what the future could entail. It's also a fantastic change management and employee engagement tool, because we've made the capital investment in those types of spaces. Agencies can bring teams to work through them and see how they want to work in the future and try and accelerate that learning get over that communication hump as to what these benefits of consolidation or working in different work modes look like.
Yeah. It seems to me, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, that what we ought to be doing is bringing in the heads of these agencies, especially the biggest offenders, and having them explain why they haven't put together a real estate plan to consolidate if they're at 25% utilization, and really put the onus on them to come back with a plan and drive this, because this has been a problem for 20 years. It's not happening. And if it's the agencies that have to put together a plan, which makes sense. I mean, it was, as governor, my leadership that drove our plan. It wasn't happening before. We need to have these agency heads start working on this plan, and that's who we should get in here and ask them why they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing with regard to right-sizing their organization and coming up with the plans they need to address for whatever remote work or whatever is going on. So anyway, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Senator Carper was going to go next. Let me just say, Senator Ricketts and I are members of a small elite group of senators, recovering governors, and we began a lot of our sentences when I was governor of Delaware or whatever. Our colleagues get tired of it, but I think we're onto something here. And we like, again, earlier I said to find out what works, do more of that. So let's see what we can learn from what you've done in your state and work together. This, I said it to Senator Capito as an aside. Tom Coper and I worked on these issues for years. Our staff worked on these issues for years and made some progress, I think, but there's more still to be done. And we look forward to addressing it with your full involvement. Thank you. Senator Capito.
Thank you. This sort of goes off what Senator Ricketts was just saying. Mr. Maroney, your study focused on headquarters buildings. What do we know about the utilization of other federal office buildings that are not headquarters?
So we don't know a lot. The quality of the data, even at the headquarters level, was variable. And out in the field, there's much less data to assess how these buildings are being utilized. I think it's a reasonable assumption that buildings in the field that are of similar nature to headquarters buildings, office spaces that are not doing customer-facing roles, policy, budget, administrative, probably have similar levels of utilization, but we did not have the data to define that work.
Do you get any kind of sense that since your testimony in July that any agencies have made any progress in terms of trying to right-size? Have you heard anything back from that?
So certainly some agencies are coming out with their in-office attendance policies, which is a crucial step to understand how many folks are going to be coming in.
Right.
You need the data from that to then figure out how much space we really need. So there has been some progress on that front. I know agencies have submitted information to OMB as well on some of their plans. So there is some forward movement here, but it's variable.
We'll see. Okay, I just want to ask about St. Elizabeth, since the chairman went out and visited yesterday, and you talked about it. Commissioner, I was the ranking member on Homeland Security appropriations. This is a big issue, trying to consolidate everything to St. Elizabeth. What is the space utilization of that facility right now?
I don't know what the actual utilization is. I will say a couple different things. Since the pandemic, particularly for a couple of their major buildings at St. Elizabeth's, DHS has rearranged some of the buildings to integrate, because of lower utilization than when it was originally planned, to integrate another 2,000 people onto the campus, so further consolidating. So they are continuing to drive utilization
They're going to
up.
drop their leases around town here to consolidate?
Correct.
Because I understood at the time that we talked about this, that there were certain agencies and others under the Homeland Security umbrella that didn't want to locate.
Right.
So they're forcing them to locate there?
Yeah, they're forcing them to locate, or frankly, agencies, now that the campus has come along so far, it's a beautiful campus, wonderful facilities, and so folks are also seeing what the advantage is of co-locating. So there's, just the passage of time and people getting used to the notion that that's where the center of the DHS headquarters is, and wanting to be close and proximate to their other colleagues.
Mr. Maroney, was Homeland Security one of your agencies that you looked
It was.
Can you, do you have it there? It's kind of.
Yes. So they were in the highest quartile. They were at about 30% utilization.
Was that at St. Elizabeth's then? Or was
that would be their headquarters, which 3 buildings. Does it include St. Elizabeth's?
Yeah, it was one of them in Nebraska.
Okay.
And
So-
how many buildings are, there's tons of buildings at St. Elizabeth's. It's not just 3 buildings.
It included the campus and then 2 other buildings off of.
Yeah, so I think just for people who are listening too, to realize that, and I think you confirmed the figures here, $2 billion is is the cost to the taxpayer every year to operate the building, is that correct? And $5 billion to lease, are those accurate figures?
5.6 to lease, and then it would be another, to properly operate the portfolio would be another $4 to $5 billion needed. We don't get that every year, as I've mentioned.
Well, what are we spending? That's what I'm saying, that's what I'm asking. I'm not asking what, I understand we don't have enough, we've made
Right.
that point pretty clear.
Right.
What are we spending, $2 billion? Do you know, Mr. Roney?
So our number is over $2 billion, yes.
$2 billion, okay. So I'm going to go back to my original question with the commissioner on these, on the IRA 100, because Senator Cardin talked about it. I think we were kind of getting around to the same point from a different direction. Are those 100 buildings going to change? Those are the ones I would think that if you're making them fully sustainable, they're going to last forever, they're going to have all the energy provisions that they are provided for the IRA. I would imagine that when you come back in a year, 2, 3 years, that the space utilization there would be 80, 90, 100%. I know nothing's occupied 100%, but in that range. Is that what you're anticipating, or will you drop buildings out if you see that they're not, that those are not the ones that warrant all this huge investment of dollars and they're just going to sit there?
Yeah. So of the 100 buildings, we are very confident that those are buildings that the federal government will occupy. We are doing, I'll give...
I mean, occupied 20, they're
No.
occupying all these other buildings at 25%.
Our job as GSA is to drive utilization of the building. That is what we aspire to do, just like any private landlord. We want that building used as fully as possible because it saves money. It also keeps, there's a whole variety of benefits to fully occupying federal space.
Right, but I mean, obviously, if that's your goal, and we're looking at buildings here in the DC area that are 25% and less, we're not hitting the goal there. So by making these buildings, the premium buildings, I would imagine that's what they are, the 5-star government buildings, we'll put it like that, where people understand what that means when you're looking at it for a hotel, that this would not just drive utilization, but I mean, there's got to be some coordination between these agencies to say, you've got to get into these buildings.
So I'll give a real example.
Good.
In Chicago, we have a more than 1 million square foot building, a core asset. And we are reinvesting in that building. And we have, since the pandemic, HHS in Chicago has identified that they want to move out of leases and consolidate into a federally owned building. So our work is to what we call restack the building, make space for HHS to come in. There's a couple other agencies that we've also been doing that with. It is done in a coordinated manner because as you're moving people around, everybody has to know what's going on in the building. That is a very different situation than, for example, the headquarters in Washington, D.C., where it's a single tenant. So out in the regions, we have buildings that are occupied by as many as 27 different agencies, and we are actively managing and moving folks around because their space needs might be 20,000 square feet, up to 100,000 square feet, very variable. And it's like a puzzle piece that we're constantly moving around to make as efficient as possible. That is only possible when the building is operable and in good shape, doesn't have elevator issues, is properly cooled and heated.
Okay, yeah, and I don't know why we can't do that in DC. I mean, why does everybody have to have their own building if it's only 25% occupied?
So in DC, what people are doing right now is because I consider utilization or occupancy an indicator. It's not actually the answer. It's an indicator of whether or not the building's fully utilized. Now people are seeing what the numbers are, in part because of the GAO report, but we're aware of it prior to that. Excited about the cost-saving opportunity. The hard work is being done now at looking at the leases across the portfolio, whether they can be consolidated into a single building. We are seeing different agencies take those actions. In some cases, in DC. GSA is actually the perfect example. We ourselves occupy an entire building, 1800 F Street. Since 2012,
We moved in there with when we had the, what was that, right after 9/11 in the buildings. We moved into your space, yes.
and it's pretty good space in half the building.
bad.
The other half of the building, we can't market because it hasn't been renovated in more than 20 years. So part of our lack of occupancy in 1800 F is that half of the building is not occupiable. because it's not in good enough working condition. The other part of the building, however, we've been able to consolidate 6 of GSA's own leases within the National Capital Region into 1800F. And so that was back in 2012, but it is an iterative process. We've reduced now 2 buildings. We used to occupy a building at 7th and D, our National Capital Region function, 1,000 people, and they have now come and consolidated into 1800F. That was pre-pandemic, literally, unfortunately, like I think 2 months prior to the pandemic beginning. Now, post-pandemic, we're shrinking our footprint even more and talking to other agencies about who might be an interested partner in consolidating into our own facility.
Well, I hope we can get this right, and so I think it could result, if we save money on all of these, the $7 billion a year, that's more money for reshaping your buildings. So I would ask that you would commit to providing me with updated list of these 100 buildings as it moves along, and their space utilization rates, and the dollar amounts of the projects from the IRA. Thank you. Thank you both.
I got a couple more questions, and then we'll wrap it up. Fortunately, we haven't had any votes, so at least not in the Senate. So we've been able to just have a good conversation. And again, we appreciate you being here with us for that. We talked a whole lot about the high-risk list. We're grateful to the GIO for producing a high-risk list for us every year, and it's important that we just not read it or say, well, there's a high-risk list, and it's important that we act on it. And in many instances, it's not possible for any one party or executive branch, legislative branch to do it by themselves. This is calls for partnerships, it calls for collaborations, and that's, as I said earlier, that's what we're pretty good at on this committee. I understand that GIO is considering adding the GSA's maintenance backlog to the high-risk list in 2025. What factors is GIO considering in making this determination?
Yes, so we've done some recent work looking at the growth in the deferred maintenance backlog in 5 years' time between 2017 and 2021. It went up by 50% to $76 billion. So it's a growing concern. We've previously had deferred maintenance on our high-risk list. We'd taken it off previously in 2010 based on some changes that had been done, but now that the backlog is increasing again, that gives us concern, and so we are definitely keeping track of that issue. It very well may appear in 2025.
Okay, thank you. This would be a question, I think, for you, Commissioner Albert. I believe July's GAO report highlights that some federal agencies are reluctant to share their operating space. We talked a little bit about that here today. Specifically, Ms. Moroney's testimony mentions that agencies officials consider what's called interagency silos, a challenge to space utilization. Commissioner Albert, how is the GSA working with federal agencies and federal departments to address barriers to co-location and operating space consolidation to achieve efficiencies?
So we're talking to agencies right now, actually, to see which agencies are prioritizing consolidating leases into their own facility. So that would be a primary and probably most desired strategy, because then you would gain the efficiencies of being consolidated. But for those agencies that, and GSA again being a prime example, will not, even after full consolidation, need to occupy an entire building. We are reaching out and identifying agencies that would be interested in co-locating with us. There are a couple agencies that fall into that category where their building, their capacity exceeds their total space needs. And what's very interesting about many, but not all, federal buildings in the National Capital Region is because of the scale and size of them, you actually can subdivide those buildings to accommodate different headquarters and still provide that, that marquee designated independent entrance that would be dedicated to a headquarters and worthy of a headquarters building. So it's an evolving conversation, primarily based on agencies wanting to first look at how can they backfill their headquarters with their existing leases, as opposed to sharing as a primary strategy. But those conversations are going on, and I think that there are very interesting models now, particularly for sharing of other types of spaces as well. I'll use conference centers, training centers. We're seeing that as people lean more into hybrid work, the types of space they need is not so much dedicated desks and offices, but now collaboration spaces. And so, again, I'll cite GSA's own example. We have a one-story conference center that is booked out for more than a year now because there's so much demand for that kind of auditorium and collaboration space. So that's where we're seeing greater demand for space. And we could see, for example, an agency consolidating perhaps in the top floors of the building and then making their bottom floors of their building available as conference centers. Lots of different strategies to include and think about.
Good, thank you. Just last week, we celebrated the anniversary of something called Kigali, which is a ratification, it's an amendment to the Montreal Protocol that phase out the use of super polluting HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, and refrigerants. The refrigeration industry is working hard to reclaim and reuse refrigerants. And reclaimed refrigerants are as good as new and competitively priced, but there isn't much of a market for them yet, we're told. Commissioner Albert, has GSA considered requiring the use of reclaimed refrigerants in new or recharged equipment as a way to reduce emissions across the federal government?
We have, and we're proud to say that we're a leader in this. We have worked very closely with industry to prove that you can reuse refrigerants in existing equipment without deteriorating or otherwise impacting existing equipment, putting forward standards in what's called our P100, which drives design standards of buildings for reused refrigerants.
All right, good. You had the opportunity to give an opening statement. Each of you did. You've been good to answer our questions, and we'll have a few more probably in writing. But is there anything you'd like to say in closing before we wrap it up here in a few minutes? Yeah, go ahead, please.
I just have one question that I can't resist asking. To both of you, GSA and GAO, what is your in-office policy, working policy? GAO, yeah.
So GAO just came out with its revised in-office policy a week or two ago, and there are many options, but it includes a remote work option. Some staff can work remotely. That becomes their official duty location. Others, depending on their role, need to come in the office 4 days a pay period, and others come in the office on a regular basis. It depends on the mission need and what that person's role is.
So we have a similar approach. We have done what we call position categorization, looked at every single position because there's so much diversity in GSA about what people do, and that is what dictates their telework status. We have building managers that must come into the office every day. And then we have procurement specialists that may qualify for remote work. A vast majority of GSA employees are in what's called kind of a telework status or a on-site flexible status. The minimum requirement for that is 2 days of pay period. And
What's a day consist of? How many hours? is that?
8 hours a day. Yeah.
Thank you.
A standard work day.
Thank you for that.
And so, but again, looking at the public building service, which is what I'm responsible for, we have construction managers who have to be on site. I mean, there's no
understand.
substitute for that. So we tend to be in the office or on site, whether it's in a physical office or on a construction site, more frequently than, for example, some of our technology colleagues. You know, it just depends based on the job.
Yeah, thank you very much. I've alluded to today a couple of times to Albert Einstein, and also to Dr. Tom Coburn, our late colleague. And Einstein used to say, as I mentioned earlier, university lies opportunity. Dr. Coburn was just unrelenting in going after waste in government, and he was a great partner. We're a great partner of ours. And I miss him to this day. But if he and a deeply religious person, as I think was Dr. Einstein, if they're looking down today at this hearing, they're probably saying, "Well, let's get this done." And my dad used to say to my sister and me when we were kids growing up, born in West Virginia and later grew up in Virginia, but used to say to us, just use some common sense. He said it a lot. You probably all remember things that your parents would say to you over and over again. My dad would say that a lot. We must not have had any common sense. But I take those words with me to every day. He was also a big one for not wasting money, his money, our family's money. And I've taken that seriously all my life. And I got to be treasurer of the state of Delaware when I was 29. We had the worst credit rating in the country, and we could only do better. And when I was governor, we made it to AAA. We still have AAA credit ratings, but we've worked hard in our state at the state level to try to spend taxpayer money a lot smarter. And I think we've done right well, and as have a lot of other states. I just want to, in closing, I just want to thank you for appearing before us today. I want to thank you for your work. I'd ask to Ms. Maroney, I'd say give our best to Gene Dodaro. One of my favorite people is our Controller General. How long's he been Controller General? Since Albert Einstein walked the earth. It's been a long time. Been a long time. Give him our best. Tell him we're still interested in these issues and committed to making progress on them. But we look forward to hearing about GSA's continued work with the federal agencies to embrace the opportunity of modernizing and right-sizing the federal real estate portfolio. And before we adjourn, a little bit of housekeeping. Senators may submit questions for the record until the close of business on Wednesday, October 11th. We will compile those questions, send them to our witnesses, and ask our witnesses to reply by Wednesday, October 25th. And before we adjourn, I just want to say to our staff, we get to sit up here and ask these questions and so forth and give speeches. We have really good staff people sit right behind us. And I just want to say to both the majority and minority staffs, thanks very much for bringing in a couple of good witnesses here and addressing an issue that really needs to be not just addressed and talked about, but acted upon. And we look forward to working with you and the folks that you work with as well. And I think with that, it's a wrap. This hearing is adjourned. Thank you, Senator Capito. Thank you very much.